The dust tasted of absence. It coated Anya's tongue, settled in the lines of her hands, and spun in the silent air of the cabin where her husband scent used to be. The sun was a hammer, beating the cracked earth into submission. It had been a year since Thomas died, but the heat of that first summer alone felt different. It was personal. It was a presence that pressed in from all sides, a constant reminder of the space he no longer occupied. All that was left of their dream was this, a swayback barn, a cabin whose bones creaked in the wind, and 3 skinny chickens that pecked at the dirt with the frantic energy of the starving. They were more like feathered ghosts, their clucking a hollow sound against the vast, indifferent quiet of the plains. The well was low. The garden was a graveyard of withered stalks. Everything Thomas had built with his broad, hopeful hands was now surrendering to the elements. The fence posts leaned like tired old men. The roof sagged in the middle, a weary sigh held for months. Anya moved through the ruin of it all with a slowness that was not laziness, but a conservation of energy, of spirit. She had forgotten the sound of her own voice some days. There was no one to speak to, and nothing that needed saying. The chickens did not require conversation. The wind did not listen. And God, if he was out here at all, was clearly occupied with other, more promising ventures. In the evenings, when the heat finally broke and the sky bled into bruised purples and soft oranges, she would sit on the porch step. She held it in her hands, a small, square box of darkwood with a tarnished silver inlay. The hinge was broken. The tiny metal comb inside was bent, 2 of its teeth snapped. It was the music box Thomas had given her on their wedding day. He'd saved for months to buy it from a traveling merchant. Its song was supposed to be their song, a delicate, hopeful melody that promised a life built together. Now, it was just another broken thing. A container for a silence where music used to be. She would trace the filigree with her thumb, feeling the grit of the day's dust in the grooves. It was too delicate for this world. Too fragile for this life. Just like the promises it had been meant to hold. One night, she almost threw it. Almost cast it out into the tall, dry grass to be swallowed by the earth. But her hand stopped mid-air. Her fingers tightened around the wood. It was his. It was the last piece of his hope she had left. And if everything was to be broken, then let it be broken in her hands, not in the dirt. She took it back inside. The door closed with a quiet click, a sound that sealed her inside the stillness once more. The next morning, she did not look at the dying garden. She did not count the ribs on the chickens. She cleared a space on the small wooden table, wiping it clean of the ever-present dust. She laid out a piece of soft leather, her awl, a spool of waxed thread, and a set of fine-nosed pliers she had always kept for her needlework. She looked at her own hands. They were chapped and dry, the nails chipped, but they were steady. They had always been steady. She began not with the music box, but with a simpler task. The leather straps on the canteen Thomas had carried were frayed nearly to breaking. With meticulous patience, she unpicked the old, rotten stitching. She cut a new thread, waxed it with a small nub of beeswax until it was strong and smooth, and began to sew. Her stitches were tiny, even, and perfectly straight. They were stitches of impossible neatness, a line of order against the chaos of decay. It was a small act. A useless act, some might say. Mending a dead man's canteen. But as her needle moved, a rhythm returned to her. A purpose that had nothing to do with hope, and everything to do with the work itself. The simple, honest act of putting one thing right. Word traveled the way it does in empty places, slowly, carried on the wind with rumor and dust. A rider on his way to the next town, stopping for water, saw her repaired well bucket. It had been cracked clean through, but she had sealed it with pine pitch and bound it with such a precise web of sinew that it held water without losing a single drop. He mentioned it at the town mercantile. The proprietor, a man whose saddlebags had a tear the size of a fist, remembered the widow on the Albright place. He rode out a week later, skeptical. He found Anya on her porch, reinforcing the seams of her own worn boots. She did not greet him with warmth, only a quiet, questioning gaze. He held out the damaged bags. Heard you were good with your hands, he mumbled, feeling foolish. Anya took them without a word. She examined the tear, the worn leather, the popped rivets. She nodded once. Come back in 3 days. When he returned, the bags were not just patched. They were stronger than they had been when new. The stitching was a work of art, a reinforcement that was both functional and strangely beautiful. He left her with a sack of flour and a slab of salted pork, more than she had seen in months. That night, for the first time in a long time, the fire in her small hearth felt less like a defense against the cold and more like a celebration. A small, flickering point of light she had made herself. News of her skill continued to spread. A broken harness, a ripped grain sack, a delicate lace collar from a preacher's wife that had been snagged on a nail. Anya mended them all. She took payment in goods, not coin. Eggs, potatoes, lamp oil, coffee. Her small pantry began to fill. She was not thriving. But she was surviving. And she was doing it with her own 2 hands, mending the broken pieces of other people's lives while her own remained in fragments around her. He arrived on a Tuesday. The heat was a physical weight, shimmering above the baked ground. His horse was favoring its front left leg, a slow, painful limp that signaled a long and difficult journey. The man himself was made of dust and sharp angles. He was tall and lean, with a hardness in his eyes that wasn't cruelty, but something older. A deep, settled weariness that had soured into suspicion. He stopped his horse by her well, but didn't approach the house. He stood there, one hand on the horse's neck, watching her as if expecting a rifle barrel to appear in the window. This was Rowan. Anya watched him from behind her curtain. He was a threat, her instincts told her. Every line of his body was coiled tight, ready for a fight or a flight. But there was something else there, too. A desperation that mirrored her own. She thought of turning him away. Of bolting the door and waiting for him to leave. It would be the sensible thing to do. The safe thing. Instead, she walked to the well, drew a bucket of cool, clear water, and left it on the stone lip. Then she drew another and poured it into the horse's trough. She did it all without looking at him, without a single word. She turned and walked back to her cabin, closing the door softly behind her. It was an offering without obligation, a gesture that asked for nothing in return. He watched her go, his expression unreadable. For a long time, he did not move. Then, slowly, he let the horse drink. He drank himself, long and deep, from the bucket she had left. He did not leave. As dusk fell, he made a small, smokeless fire 100 yards from the cabin, rolled himself in his bedroll, and lay down with his saddle for a pillow. He was still there when the sun rose. He was testing her. And she was testing him. A silent negotiation in the vast, empty landscape. He had not asked for help. And she had not asked him to go. 3 days passed in this silent arrangement. Rowan tended to his horse's leg, his movements economical and precise. He never approached the house. Anya continued her work, mending a child's worn blanket, her needle moving in and out of the faded wool. She would leave a bucket of water at the well each morning. He would use it and retreat to his camp. It was a strange, unspoken truce. On the 4th morning, another figure appeared at the edge of the property. This one came on foot, a small silhouette against the rising sun. As the figure drew closer, Anya could see it was a young woman, perhaps no older than 20. She was thin, her dress ragged, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion. She carried nothing. She walked as if each step was her last. This was Maeve. She stopped at the broken fence line, 100 yards from both the cabin and Rowan's camp, and simply sat down in the dust. She wrapped her arms around her knees and stared out at the horizon, as if she had walked to the end of the world and found nothing there. Rowan saw her immediately. He stood up, his hand moving instinctively to the knife on his belt. He saw her as another complication, another mouth, another danger. His posture was a wall of hostility. Anya watched them both. She saw the girl's profound weariness, the way she seemed to be trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. She was not a threat. She was a ghost. Anya went inside. She ladled some of the thin broth she'd made from chicken bones into a bowl and added a small piece of cornbread. She walked out of the cabin, not towards Maeve, but to a large, flat rock that sat halfway between them. She placed the bowl and the bread on the rock and walked back inside without a glance in the girl's direction. The offering sat there all day under the hot sun. Rowan watched it, then the girl, his suspicion a palpable thing. Maeve did not move. But as the last light faded from the sky, she slowly, cautiously, rose to her feet. She crept to the rock, snatched the food, and retreated back to her spot at the fence line, eating with the desperate hunger of a wild animal. A community of the broken had begun to form, not with words, but with water and bread. Weeks bled into a month. The rhythm of their days settled into a strange, silent routine. Rowan, having determined Anya was not going to drive him off, began to make himself useful. He never asked permission. He simply saw a need and filled it. He used his knife to cut and shape a new axle peg for the rickety wagon. He spent 2 days resetting the leaning fence posts, his movements filled with a contained, simmering energy. He never spoke of where he had come from or where he was going. His past was a locked room, and he stood guard at the door. Maeve, in turn, slowly migrated from the fence line to the barn. She would disappear for hours at a time, hiding in the hayloft like a frightened sparrow. But she was always there in the mornings, a silent presence at the edge of the yard. Anya continued to be their anchor. She would leave food for Maeve on the barn stoop and share her own meager meals with Rowan, eating with him in a companionable silence on the porch steps. Her mending work brought in a steady trickle of supplies, enough for the 3 of them. One evening, Anya brought the music box outside. The air was cooling, and the first stars were appearing in the deep indigo sky. She sat on the step, her fine tools laid out on a piece of leather beside her. With the delicate touch of a surgeon, she began to work on the tiny, intricate mechanism, trying to coax the bent metal teeth back into alignment. Rowan sat nearby, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. He watched her for a long time. "It won't work," he said, his voice rough from disuse. It was the first full sentence he had offered. Anya didn't look up from her delicate work. The tiny gears gleamed in the lantern light. "Maybe," she replied, her voice soft. The word hung in the air between them. It wasn't a contradiction. It was a possibility. A small, fragile thing, much like the melody trapped inside the broken box. The fire inside the cabin cast a warm, steady glow through the open door, pushing back against the immense, star-filled darkness that surrounded them. The sky had been a searing, cloudless blue for weeks, but one afternoon a change came. The air grew heavy, thick with a charge that made the hairs on Anya's arms stand up. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the western horizon, piling on top of one another with a silent, ominous speed. The wind picked up, kicking dust devils across the yard and rattling the loose shutter on the cabin window. The chickens sensed it first, scurrying into their coop with nervous clucks. The first clap of thunder was a distant rumble, a growl from a caged beast. Then it came closer, a sharp crack that split the air. Rain followed, not a gentle shower, but a violent, wind-driven deluge that turned the dusty ground to instant mud. Anya called from the doorway. "Get inside!" Rowan, who had been securing a top over the woodpile, hesitated for only a second before striding into the cabin, dripping water onto the floorboards. Maeve was already there. Anya had found her huddled in the barn, her eyes wide with terror, and had gently guided her into the house just as the storm broke. The 3 of them were trapped in the small space, the storm raging outside. The proximity was a physical pressure. Maeve curled into a tight ball in the far corner, her hands over her ears, flinching with every boom of thunder. Rowan stood stiffly by the single window, his back to the room, staring out at the sheets of rain as if daring the storm to do its worst. Anya, seeing their fear, sat at the table and calmly picked up a piece of leather she was mending. Her needle moved with the same steady, unhurried rhythm as always. A sudden, brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the room, bleaching it of all color for a split second. In that stark, white light, Anya saw it. A thick, jagged scar that ran from Rowan's left wrist halfway up his forearm, a permanent mark of some past violence he kept hidden beneath his rolled-down sleeve. He must have felt her gaze, because he turned from the window, his expression instantly shuttering into that familiar, defensive anger. But this time, Anya saw the fear behind it. The look of a man who expected judgment, who expected revulsion. She held his gaze for a moment, then she stood, poured a mug of hot chicory from the pot on the hearth, and held it out to him. "The roof is holding," she said quietly. Her words were not about the rain. He took the mug, his fingers brushing hers. The anger in his face receded, replaced by a flicker of confusion, of surprise. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the small cabin, something had broken. A fragile piece began to settle in its place. The wagon was an intrusion. It appeared as a dark speck on the eastern horizon and crawled slowly toward them, its polished sides catching the morning sun in a way that felt unnatural in this landscape of muted, earthy tones. It did not belong here. As it drew closer, Anya felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She recognized the matched set of grey horses, the confident posture of the driver. Mr. and Mrs. Albright. Thomas's parents. They had not come for the funeral. They had sent a letter, crisp and formal, expressing their condolences and their long-held belief that this westward venture had been a tragic mistake from the start. They had disapproved of Anya, the quiet daughter of a mender, and they had certainly disapproved of their son sinking his inheritance into a patch of sun-baked dirt. Now, here they were, their fine city clothes already collecting a film of dust, their faces pinched with displeasure as they took in the state of the ranch. Mrs. Albright's gaze swept over the scene, the mended fence, the strange man standing near the barn, the wisp of a girl who peered out from the shadows. Her eyes, so much like Thomas's but without any of his warmth, settled on Anya with a look that was a mixture of pity and accusation. "Anya, my dear," she said, her voice carrying a brittle authority. Mr. Albright, a man diminished by grief and the long journey, simply nodded, his expression grim. They did not ask how she had survived. They did not acknowledge the silent figures of Rowan and Maeve, treating them as if they were part of the landscape, like rocks or scrub brush. They had come with a purpose, an agenda that had been decided weeks ago in a comfortable parlor 1,000 miles away. They had come to correct their son's mistake. They had come to take her back. They sat at her small table, the Albrights looking deeply uncomfortable on the rough-hewn chairs. Mrs. Albright placed a gloved hand on the tabletop, then drew it back as if she'd touched something unclean. "We have come to take you home," she announced, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "This place. It is not suitable. It was a foolish dream of Thomas's, and it is time to let it go." Mr. Albright cleared his throat. "We have a room for you in our house. You will be cared for. It is our duty." Their words were heavy with obligation, with a sense of ownership that Anya had never felt from them before. They spoke of Thomas constantly, leveraging his memory as a tool to get what they wanted. "Thomas would have wanted you to be safe," his mother insisted. "He would never have wanted you living like this, with strangers." Her eyes flickered towards the doorway, where Rowan stood, silent and watchful. He was a threat in their eyes, a vagrant, a piece of the wilderness that had claimed their son and was now threatening to claim his wife. Maeve had vanished, retreating to the deepest shadows of the barn, her presence felt only as an absence. Anya listened, her hands resting in her lap, perfectly still. She looked at their faces, etched with a grief that had curdled into resentment. They saw her survival not as a strength, but as a failure to remain the helpless, grieving widow they expected. They saw her companions not as people, but as evidence of her decline. Their offer was a cage disguised as a rescue. A return to a life where she would be a dependent, a living memorial to their lost son. Her own quiet strength sanded down until it was smooth, polite, and unrecognizable. A life of soft hands and silent obedience. She felt the weight of two worlds pressing in on her, the world of her past, of duty and expectation, and the world she had built here, a fragile, unspoken family of broken things that were slowly, painstakingly, being mended. Anya's gaze drifted from Mrs. Albright's expectant face to a corner of the room where a collection of items waited to be mended. Among them was Rowan's canteen, its strap now perfectly repaired, stronger than new. She reached over, her movements deliberate, and picked it up. She ran her thumb over the tight, even stitches. It was a small thing, an object of little value, but it was a piece of this new life. A testament to shared survival. She looked back at her in-laws, her expression calm, her voice quiet but firm. "I am home." The 3 words fell into the silence of the cabin with the weight of a dropped stone. They were simple, absolute, and left no room for negotiation. Mrs. Albright's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at her husband for support, but he merely stared at his hands, his certainty wavering in the face of Anyar's placid resolve. He had expected tears, arguments, gratitude. He was not prepared for this quiet dignity, this unshakable sense of place. But Anyar, his wife, began again, her tone pleading. "There is nothing for you here." Anyar stood up. She walked to the water bucket, dipped a ladle in, and filled 2 clean tin cups. She offered them to the Albrights. It was an act of finality. An offering for their journey away from her. "The road back is long and dusty," she said. Her kindness was a blade, cleanly severing the ties of obligation they had tried to wrap around her. Mr. Albright took the cup, drank it in one go, and stood. The meeting was over. They walked back to their fine wagon, their shoulders slumped in defeat. Anyar watched them go, standing in the doorway of her cabin. She watched until the wagon was just another speck of dust on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the plains. Then, she turned and closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking into place was not an end, but a beginning. She was no longer Thomas's widow. She was Anyar. And this was her ranch. She turned back to the room. Rowan was still there, leaning against the far wall. His expression was one she had never seen before, not anger, not suspicion, but a deep, quiet respect. From the barn, a shadow moved. Maeve was peeking around the doorframe, her face hesitant, but her eyes fixed on Anyar. Nothing was fixed. Nothing was solved. But a choice had been made. A boundary had been drawn in the dust. That evening, a new sound entered the small cabin. It was faint, hesitant at first, like a memory of a sound rather than the thing itself. A tiny, metallic tinkling. A fragile, imperfect melody that rose and fell in the quiet air. Anyar sat at the table, the small music box open in her hands. She had done it. She had patiently, meticulously, coaxed the bent teeth of the comb back into place, cleaned the gears, and mended the broken hinge with a sliver of tin and 2 impossibly small rivets. The song was thin, and it stuttered in places, but it was there. A ghost of a melody, brought back to life. Rowan stood in the open doorway, his silhouette framed against the deep purple of the twilight sky. He didn't speak, just listened. Maeve crept out of the barn and sat on the bottom step of the porch, her arms wrapped around her knees, her head tilted as she followed the delicate notes. The song was one of hope, but it was a different kind of hope now. Not the naive promise of a perfect life, but the stubborn, resilient hope of the broken. The hope that comes after the breaking. It was a testament to the idea that some things, even after they have been shattered, can be made to sing again. The small fire in the hearth crackled, casting their long shadows against the cabin walls. Anyar looked from the music box to the 2 figures who had become her unlikely, unspoken family. A man who had forgotten how to trust. A girl who had forgotten how to speak. And her, a woman who had learned to mend. They were a collection of fragments, held together by the vast, empty space and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to believe that broken meant finished. The narrator's voice, calm and steady, speaks over the final image of the 3 of them, listening in the dusk. What do you do when the life you planned is gone, and all that's left is the wreckage? You find the one thing you can still put right. You pick up the needle, or the hammer, or the pen. You find the thing your hands know how to do. And you begin. Where, in your own life, is the ruin you have been given? And what is the thing your hands know how to mend?